May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Good morning, people of St. Paul's, on this beautiful Sunday. Welcome to our service. Our introit hymn is hymn number 415 from Songs of Fellowship. O God, our help in ages past. The music group strikes up and off we go. Each Sunday, we begin our Eucharist service with music in the form of a hymn. And our first thoughts on hearing the announcement might very well vary from, oh good, I really enjoy singing this hymn, to what? I don't know this one, I hope I enjoy it, I hope it's not too complicated. But do we pay enough attention to the very words that we will be singing? Do we actually ever think further about the person or composer who wrote them? Do we think about the background that perhaps led them to produce something that is so intrinsic to our worship? Speaking for myself, probably not. We just accept that hymns are hymns and part and parcel of our church worship. We all know about Bible study, and perhaps we should set aside a bit of time for hymn study, which I found can be very rewarding with much biblical inspiration. And that's what we will be doing in our Advent series of sermons. Take our introit hymn today, which is a particularly fascinating example. From Matthew 1:23, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. O come, Emmanuel is a hymn for Advent and Christmas, celebrating the coming birth of Christ. It's a translation of a Latin hymn, Veni Vini Emmanuel, and the 1861 translation by John Mason Neale from Hymns Ancient and Modern is probably the most well-known in the English-speaking world. John M. Neale's life is a study in contrasts. He was born in 1818 into an evangelical home. He had sympathies towards Rome. He was in perpetual ill health, but he was incredibly passionate and productive. But before he died, before even getting to the age of 60, he wrote or translated nearly 400 hymns and texts, many of which are still in common use. Just stunning. The lyrics and the melody for O Come, Emmanuel emerged independently. The Latin text was first documented in Germany in 1710, whereas the melody most commonly associated in the English-speaking world has its origins in 15th century France. And this ancient Advent hymn grew out of the great O antiphons, which was part of the medieval Roman Catholic Advent liturgy. The O antiphons, or chants which are used before and after a psalm, refer to the 7 antiphons that are recited or chanted preceding the Magnificat during Vespers of the Liturgy of the Hours. On each day of the week leading up to Christmas, one responsive verse would be chanted, each including a different Old Testament name for the coming Messiah. When we sing each verse of this hymn, we are acknowledging Christ as the fulfillment of all these Old Testament prophecies. And the exact origin of the O antiphons is not really known. Boethius, who was a Roman senator and philosopher, made reference to them around about the year 500, thereby suggesting that they were already around. By the 8th century, they are in use in the liturgical celebrations in Rome. So in some fashion, the O antiphons have been part of our liturgical tradition since the very early church. And the importance of the O antiphons is twofold. As we've heard, each one highlights a title for the Messiah. O Sapientia, O Wisdom. O Adonai, O Lord. O Radix Jesse, O Root of Jesse. O Clavus David, O Key of David. O Oriens, O Rising Sun. O Rex Gentium, O King of the Nations. And O Emmanuel, God is with us. Also, each one refers to the prophecy of Isaiah of the coming of the Messiah. So they're all interlinked and intertwinkled, if I could say that word. Christ's first coming gives us a reason to rejoice again and again. And yet we know that all is not well in the world. We are living in the between times. So along with our rejoicing leading up to Christmas, we plead, using the words of this hymn, that Christ would come again to perfectly fulfill the promise that all darkness will be turned to light. These names in themselves should give us something to think about as we wonder each year at the miracle that God became flesh and dwelt among us. You may or may not know, I didn't, that an acrostic is a poem or some other form of writing in which the first letter of each line spells a word or message. And there's a school of thought that if one looks back at the 7 names of Christ that we've talked about in reverse order, you get Emmanuel, Rex, Oriens, Clavus, Radix, Adonai, and Serpentia. We find there's an acrostic through which the Lord responds to the saying of these, Ero Cras, which can be translated as, tomorrow I will come, or I shall be with you tomorrow. It's a timely passage as on the 8th night, or the 23rd of December, the refrain was sung for the last time. Rejoice, rejoice, O Israel, to thee shall come Emmanuel. And the Lord responds, behold, I'm coming soon. This is the promise we hold to as we sing this beautiful hymn. The reference to Christ in each verse of this hymn thus exemplifies Christ as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. O come, thy day spring, come and cheer our spirits, thy time advent here. 1500 years gives a lot of time to make changes to the different texts. And like the original Latin poem, J.M. Neale's translation from 1851 contains 7 stanzas. Today, many modern hymnals contain only 5, like our Songs of Fellowship. And a refrain was also added to the original text, that is the familiar, rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. O come, Emmanuel is set to the tune Veni Emmanuel, which was adapted by Thomas Helmore, a 19th century choirmaster. And it's a haunting and almost pleading tune that beautifully supports the words of longing found in the text, with a hopeful change into the familiar refrain, rejoice, rejoice, after each verse. In the season of Advent, we can anticipate the arrival of the Messiah on 2 levels. First, we can seek to place ourselves in the historical shoes of Israel, as they waited for centuries for the arrival of the Messiah. When we sing songs like O come, Emmanuel, with its lyrics about ransoming captive Israel, who mourns in lonely exile here, we are remembering the early Israelites as they awaited the arrival of God's anointed. On the second level, we can anticipate Christ's second coming, what the New Testament writers like Matthew and Paul referred to as his parousia, his arrival. That word parousia is actually the Greek word that gets translated to adventus in Latin, so it's the original word for Advent. Just before the beginning of today's Gospel passage, Jesus discusses the nature of God's coming, judgment against Israel. Israel was being judged for its repeated failure to live as the people of God in the world. Historically, this judgment did indeed come with the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem by Rome in 70 AD. For many in Jesus' day, this final judgment on the corrupt Jerusalem elite was tied with the parousia, the arrival of the Messiah, who would bring about justice and usher in God's reign over the whole world. But the final arrival of the Messiah, Jesus, speaks of happening later in time. And unlike the destruction of the temple, which Jesus says will happen before all the disciples pass away, Jesus explicitly says that God the Father is the only one who knows when this coming, this Advent, will be. The coming of the Son of Man. Those words should give us both concern and joy, and they should cause us to take seriously Jesus' command to keep watch, because we do not want to be caught unaware when our King comes with his holy justice. Advent, then, is the anticipation of this day. We await the final coming when the resurrected King enters his kingdom, bringing justice and goodness with him. The incarnation, the birth of Christ in Bethlehem, has begun this final arrival of God's light in this world, which is filled with darkness. Further still, the decisive battle has already been won. Advent, in many ways, calls us to remember our state of watchfulness. It reminds us that we are the people of God, living in what many theologians call the now and the not yet. The now of Christ's decisive victory at the defeat of death, the not yet of the final collapse of evil and sin. As we say, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. We keep watch for that day when Christ will come again. And this is what Advent should mean to us. It reminds us that divine justice is coming. It reminds us that divine love is the final word in our world. And so we wait and keep watch in eager anticipation of the coming of the Son of Man. Veni, veni, Emmanuel. O come,